He defeated the Parthians, stopped the Germanic invasions, survived the plague that killed millions. For 19 years, he held Rome together when it should have collapsed. The philosopher-emperor, the Stoic who wrote the Meditations. Then he made one choice, a choice that shattered everything he'd fought for. 12 years later, Rome's golden age was dead. The empire he saved, destroyed from within. Marcus Aurelius, the man who defeated every enemy on earth except the one in his own palace. How does Rome's greatest emperor doom the empire he died to protect? This is the tragedy of Marcus Aurelius, the story they never teach. Part 1. The Making of a Philosopher King. On April 26, 121 AD, in the heart of Rome, a boy was born into extraordinary privilege. His name was Marcus Annius Verus, and from his first breath, he was destined for greatness, or at least Rome's aristocracy believed so. His father, also named Marcus Annius Verus, held the rank of praetor, one of the highest judicial positions in the Roman government. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, came from a family whose wealth was staggering, even by imperial standards. Her family owned massive brick factories across Italy, and Rome's endless construction boom had made them fantastically rich. The boy would never want for anything material. The house where Marcus grew up stood on the Caelian Hill, one of Rome's 7 hills, in a neighborhood populated by senators, generals, and the political elite. Marble columns, mosaic floors, private libraries, Greek slaves who served as tutors. This was the world of Rome's 1%, and Marcus was born at its center. But wealth and privilege came with expectations. Roman aristocratic families were not simply rich. They were custodians of tradition, duty, and public service. From childhood, Marcus was trained to lead. When Marcus was only 3 years old, his father died. The circumstances are unclear. Ancient sources provide no details about the death of Marcus Annius Verus the Elder. What matters is that young Marcus was raised primarily by his grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, a man who had been consul 3 times. In Roman politics, the consulship was the pinnacle of achievement, and holding it 3 times marked a man as exceptionally distinguished. The elder Verus became the defining male influence in the boy's life. The grandfather taught the boy that a man could be powerful without being cruel, that authority did not require intimidation. These lessons helped in shaping Marcus. Rome in the 120s and 130s AD was at the absolute zenith of human civilization. Emperor Hadrian ruled an empire that stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the Sahara Desert, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. The empire encompassed approximately 5 million square kilometers and governed 70 million people. The Roman army numbered around 400,000 professional soldiers, stationed in permanent bases across dozens of provinces. Roman roads connected every corner of this vast territory. A merchant could travel from Londinium to Jerusalem using paved highways protected by Roman law. Aqueducts brought fresh water to cities housing hundreds of thousands. Public baths, theaters, forums, and libraries existed in every major urban center. Into this golden age, Marcus received an education that would be extraordinary in any era. His family hired the finest teachers money could procure. Apollonius of Chalcedon, a Stoic philosopher known for his moral rigor, taught him the fundamentals of ethics and logic. Alexander of Kotiaeum, called the clay Plato for his eloquence, instructed him in Greek rhetoric. Marcus learned to speak and write Greek as fluently as Latin. For educated Romans, Greek was the language of culture, philosophy, and intellectual discourse. Fronto, the greatest Latin rhetorician of the age, became Marcus's most beloved teacher, and their correspondence survived for future generations to study. But the most influential teacher came later. Junius Rusticus, a Stoic philosopher and close advisor to Emperor Antoninus Pius, introduced the teenage Marcus to the writings of Epictetus. Epictetus had been a slave in Rome decades earlier, owned by Nero's secretary. After gaining his freedom, he established a school of philosophy in Greece, teaching a rigorous form of Stoicism that emphasized inner freedom regardless of external circumstances. His teachings were compiled by a student named Arrian in a text called the Discourses. For Marcus, reading Epictetus was transformative. Stoicism offered a complete philosophy of life, a framework for understanding duty, mortality, virtue, and acceptance. The Stoics taught that the universe operated according to rational principles, that humans were part of a larger cosmic order, and that true freedom came from controlling one's reactions rather than trying to control events. Some things are up to us, and some things are not, Epictetus had taught. What is up to us? Our judgments, our impulses, our desires. What is not up to us? Everything else. Marcus embraced Stoicism with the fervor of a convert. He began sleeping on the floor instead of his luxurious bed. He wore simple wool tunics instead of expensive silk. He studied philosophy for hours each day, memorizing passages and practicing the Stoic exercises of negative visualization, imagining loss, death, and disaster to prepare himself emotionally. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, worried that her son was becoming too ascetic, too removed from practical reality. She feared he would become a philosopher hermit rather than a proper Roman statesman. She had reason to worry, but not for the reasons she imagined. Marcus would never escape politics. Politics would consume him entirely. But his philosophical training would shape how he approached power in ways that were both his greatest strength and ultimately his most significant limitation. By his early teenage years, Marcus had attracted the attention of Emperor Hadrian himself. Hadrian was one of Rome's most complex emperors, brilliant, cultured, ruthless, and increasingly paranoid. He had spent much of his reign traveling the empire, building monuments, reforming administration, and securing frontiers. He built the wall across northern Britain that still bears his name. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome with its revolutionary concrete dome. He created a vast villa at Tivoli filled with architectural wonders. But Hadrian had no biological children, and as he aged, the question of succession became critical. In 136 AD, Hadrian adopted Lucius Ceionius Commodus, a handsome and charming senator from a distinguished family. The man was renamed Lucius Aelius Caesar and designated as heir to the empire. But Aelius was mediocre at best and possibly incompetent. On January 1st, 138 AD, he died suddenly. Sources suggest tuberculosis or possibly poison. Hadrian, now in his 60s and suffering from illness, needed a new plan urgently. The emperor's choice fell on Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a senator in his early 50s who had governed the province of Asia, modern Western Turkey, with competence and fairness. Antoninus was respected but not particularly distinguished, a safe choice, solid but unexciting. But Hadrian had a more sophisticated plan. As a condition of adopting Antoninus, Hadrian required that Antoninus immediately adopt two boys, 17-year-old Marcus Annius Verus and 7-year-old Lucius Ceionius Commodus, the son of Hadrian's deceased first choice. On February 25th, 138 AD, the complex adoption arrangement was formalized. Antoninus became Hadrian's son and heir. Marcus became Antoninus's son. His name changed from Marcus Annius Verus to Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus, a mouthful that reflected his new position in the imperial succession. The young Lucius Commodus also entered the imperial family. Hadrian had engineered a double succession, planning not just for the next emperor, but for the one after that. 4 months later, on July 10th, 138 AD, Hadrian died at his seaside villa in Baiae, south of Rome. He was 62 years old. His final years had been marked by cruelty, he executed multiple senators and military commanders on suspicion of conspiracy, tarnishing a reign that had otherwise been extraordinary. The Senate initially refused to deify Hadrian, disgusted by his late-reign executions. Antoninus had to pressure, plead, and ultimately threatened to resign before the Senate agreed to grant Hadrian divine honors. This act of loyalty and filial piety earned Antoninus the cognomen pious, dutiful, devoted. Marcus Aurelius, now 17, became Caesar, the official title for the designated heir to the empire. What followed was unprecedented in Roman history, a 23-year apprenticeship. For more than 2 decades, Marcus would serve under Antoninus Pius, learning every aspect of imperial governance. No heir before or after would receive such extensive preparation for supreme power. Antoninus Pius proved to be exactly what Rome needed after Hadrian's turbulent final years. He was steady, competent, and uninterested in grand gestures. He rarely left Italy, governing through capable subordinates and maintaining the imperial bureaucracy with quiet efficiency. Wars were few and brief. The economy prospered. Building projects continued. The empire functioned smoothly, almost boringly. For 23 years, Antoninus provided stability, and Marcus watched and learned. The relationship between Antoninus and Marcus was genuinely affectionate. Antoninus treated Marcus not as a subordinate, but as a partner in governance. Marcus attended Senate meetings, participated in legal judgments, and gradually took on administrative responsibilities. He was given proconsular power, allowing him to issue commands in the emperor's name. By his 30s, Marcus was essentially co-ruling with Antoninus in all but title. In 145 AD, Marcus married Faustina the Younger, daughter of Emperor Antoninus Pius. Marcus was 24. Faustina was probably around 16. The marriage was both political and personal, arranged to solidify dynastic continuity, but also, by all accounts, genuinely affectionate. Marcus loved Faustina, and the depth of that love would be tested by vicious rumors that followed her throughout her life. Faustina became one of the most gossiped about women in Roman history. She supposedly took lovers from every social class: gladiators, actors, sailors, senators. The rumors claimed she conducted affairs openly, that Marcus knew and tolerated them, that she was insatiable and shameless. The Historia Augusta even suggests that Commodus, Marcus's son and heir, was actually fathered by a gladiator, not by Marcus. Modern historians largely dismissed these accusations as typical sexist slander directed at powerful imperial women. Roman historians routinely accused empresses of sexual immorality. It was a standard trope, deployed against nearly every emperor's wife, regardless of actual behavior. Women who wielded influence, threatened male-dominated power structures, and sexual allegations were the easiest way to undermine them. Agrippina, Messalina, Julia, the list of slandered imperial women is long. What matters is that Marcus never believed the rumors, or if he did, he chose to stand by his wife regardless. In his meditations, he wrote of Faustina with respect and affection. He praised her devotion to their children, her support during difficult times, her loyalty. Marcus and Faustina had 13 children together. This number is staggering, even by Roman standards where large families were common. But the mortality rate was equally staggering. Only 6 children survived to adulthood, and only one son, Commodus, lived past childhood. Infant and child mortality in ancient Rome was horrific. Perhaps 30% of children died before age 1, and half died before age 10. Even with the best medical care available in the empire, even with unlimited resources, death took Marcus's children year after year. Each loss must have reinforced Marcus's Stoic philosophy. The Stoics taught that death was natural, inevitable, and ultimately beyond human control. They practiced negative visualization, imagining the death of loved ones precisely to prepare for the reality when it came. But knowing philosophically that death is inevitable, doesn't make the actual experience of losing a child less painful. Marcus buried child after child, maintaining his composure in public while privately writing in his journal about the necessity of accepting fate. By 160 AD, Antoninus Pius was 74 years old. He had ruled for 22 years without major crisis, no significant wars, no rebellions, no disasters. The empire was peaceful and prosperous. Succession was secure. Everything suggested a smooth transition when death came. On March 7th, 161 AD, at his estate in Lorium, about 12 miles west of Rome, Antoninus Pius died. Ancient sources report that his final word was equanimitas, equanimity, balance, acceptance. It was a perfectly stoic death for a man who had embodied stability. The Senate immediately proclaimed Marcus Aurelius as emperor. He was 39 years old, healthy, well-trained, and ready. He had spent 23 years preparing for this moment. And then Marcus did something that shocked everyone. He refused to accept sole power. Marcus insisted that Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, be elevated to equal status as co-emperor, not as junior partner or Caesar, but as full Augustus with equivalent authority. The Senate was bewildered. Rome had never had two equal emperors ruling simultaneously. The closest precedent was when emperors designated heirs and shared certain powers, but always with clear hierarchy. Marcus was proposing genuine co-rule. The reasoning was complex. Politically, Marcus was honoring Hadrian's original succession arrangement that had included Lucius. Personally, Marcus seemed genuinely committed to sharing the burden of power. He had spent his entire life reading about duty, virtue, and the corrupting influence of absolute power. Perhaps he believed that shared authority would prevent the tyranny that ruined so many emperors. Perhaps he simply didn't want to rule alone. The Senate approved the unprecedented arrangement. On the same day Marcus became emperor, so did Lucius Verus. They were brothers by adoption, emperors by joint proclamation, and utterly different in temperament. Marcus was philosophical, serious, devoted to duty. Lucius was pleasure-seeking, fond of luxury, more interested in entertainment than in administration. But Marcus trusted him, loved him as a brother, and genuinely wanted to share power. The two emperors took control of an empire at its absolute peak. Rome in 161 AD was the wealthiest, most powerful state on earth. The frontiers were secure. The legions were undefeated. Trade flourished from Britain to India. Cities across the empire housed populations in the hundreds of thousands with public amenities that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had endured for nearly 2 centuries. Citizens could travel safely from one end of the empire to the other. Pirates had been eradicated from the Mediterranean. Bandits were suppressed. Roman law provided unprecedented stability and justice. Marcus Aurelius had inherited paradise. Within 6 months, it began to crumble. Part 2. The Parthian War and the Antonine Plague. The first crisis came from the east. In late 161 AD, only months after Marcus and Lucius took power, Vologases IV, king of the Parthian Empire, launched a massive invasion of Rome's eastern provinces. The Parthians were not barbarians. They were a sophisticated Persian empire with their own ancient culture, advanced military, and imperial ambitions. For 2 centuries, Rome and Parthia had faced each other across the Euphrates River in a tense standoff, occasionally broken by war. Under Antoninus Pius, relations had been stable. Now, sensing opportunity with new and untested emperors, Vologases struck. The Parthian strategy was sophisticated. They invaded Armenia first, a client kingdom that served as a buffer state between the 2 empires. Armenia's loyalty was always in question. Geographically closer to Parthia, culturally influenced by both powers, the Armenian kings played both sides depending on which seemed stronger. In 161 AD, Vologases deposed Rome's Armenian client and installed his own candidate. It was a direct challenge to Roman authority and prestige. The Roman governor of Cappadocia, Marcus Sedatius Severianus, responded with confidence bordering on arrogance. He gathered a full legion, approximately 5,000 heavy infantry plus auxiliary troops, totaling perhaps 20,000 men, and marched into Armenia to restore Roman control, and the result was catastrophic. The Parthian army surrounded and destroyed Severianus's entire force. The governor died along with virtually all his soldiers. It was the worst Roman military defeat in decades. The disaster cascaded. With the Roman army in Armenia destroyed, Parthian forces swept into Syria. The governor of Syria, Cornelius Pronto, panicked and abandoned his province. Parthian cavalry raided Roman territory, almost unopposed. Cities that had lived under Roman protection for generations suddenly faced enemy soldiers. The psychological impact was immense. Rome's eastern provinces, which had known peace and stability for a century, were now war zones. News of the defeat reached Rome like a thunderbolt. The Senate was alarmed. The Roman people, accustomed to hearing about victories, couldn't comprehend the scale of the disaster. Marcus and Lucius faced their first major test as emperors, and the entire empire watched to see how they would respond. The decision they made was both politically calculated and pragmatic. Lucius Verus would travel east and take personal command of the war effort. This made sense on multiple levels. Having an emperor personally lead the army showed the Parthians that Rome took the threat seriously. It allowed Marcus to remain in Rome, handling civil administration, maintaining stability in the capital. It also gave Lucius something useful to do. His talents, whatever they were, did not lie in bureaucratic administration. Putting him in command of a military campaign played to his strengths, while keeping him away from the Senate and court politics, where his lack of interest in detail was problematic. In 162 AD, Lucius departed for Syria with reinforcements, supplies, and Rome's finest generals. As he journeyed east, Lucius stopped at every major city to enjoy banquets, games, and entertainment. He was more interested in pleasures than in war, that he delayed unnecessarily, that he approached the campaign with unseemly casualness. Lucius then appointed Statius Priscus, an experienced general, as governor of Cappadocia with orders to retake Armenia. Avidius Cassius, an aggressive and brilliant military commander, received command of operations in Syria. Martius Verus took charge of the Mesopotamian offensive. These men were the best Rome had, experienced, capable, and given the resources and authority to wage war effectively. The Roman counteroffensive began in 163 AD. Statius Priscus led his legions into Armenia and crushed the Parthian occupation force in a series of engagements. By the end of the year, Rome had retaken Armenia and installed Sohaemus, a Roman client, as king. The buffer state was restored, and the Parthians were pushed back across the Euphrates. But Marcus and Lucius wanted more than restoration of the status quo. They wanted to punish Parthia decisively. In 164 AD, Avidius Cassius invaded Parthian territory proper. This was not a defensive campaign, but a full-scale invasion of the enemy homeland. Roman legions crossed the Euphrates and drove deep into Mesopotamia, the heartland of Parthian power. The campaign was brutal and relentless. Roman forces besieged and captured city after city. Dura Europos, a fortress city on the Euphrates, fell to Roman assault. Cassius pushed his army down the Euphrates toward the Parthian capital itself. In 165 AD, the Romans reached Seleucia on the Tigris, one of the great cities of the ancient world. Seleucia was enormous. It housed over 400,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on earth at that time. It was a center of Greek culture in the east, a commercial hub, and a symbol of Parthian power. The Romans besieged the city, breached its walls, and sacked it completely. The devastation was brutal. The city was burned. Tens of thousands were killed. Survivors were sold into slavery, and Rome's legions looted treasures accumulated over centuries. But the ultimate prize was Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital located across the Tigris River from Seleucia. Ctesiphon was the royal residence, the seat of Parthian government, the symbol of their empire. In late 165 AD, Roman forces approached the city. King Vologases IV, whose invasion had started this war, abandoned his capital without significant resistance. The Parthian army had been so thoroughly defeated that they could not defend their own king's palace. Roman soldiers entered Ctesiphon, looted the royal treasury, and claimed complete victory. The war was over. Rome had not simply defeated the Parthian invasion, they had invaded Parthia, conquered their capital, and humiliated their empire. It was one of Rome's most complete military victories in the Eastern Theater. Lucius Verus prepared to return to Rome in triumph. The Senate voted for a formal triumph to be celebrated by both emperors. Marcus and Lucius would ride together through Rome's streets in a victory parade, displaying Parthian prisoners and captured treasure to the cheering crowds. And then the soldiers came home, carrying death in their blood. The Antonine Plague arrived in Rome in late 165 or early 166 AD. Ancient sources don't provide the medical detail necessary for modern diagnosis, but the symptoms they describe, high fever, skin pustules, internal bleeding, severe pain, suggest either smallpox or measles. Whatever the specific disease, it was catastrophic. The plague spread with terrifying speed across the Mediterranean world, killing indiscriminately. Modern epidemiological models and ancient population estimates suggest the death toll was staggering, and conservative estimates place total deaths at 5 million over the 15 years the plague raged. More aggressive estimates reach 10 million or higher. For an empire of approximately 70 million people, this represented a mortality rate of 7 to 15%. Entire regions were depopulated, villages were abandoned, cities that had thrived for centuries saw their populations collapse. Cassius Dio, who lived through the plague as a young man, wrote that at its height, 2,000 people died daily in Rome alone. The city's population was probably around 1 million at the time, meaning that roughly 1 person in 500 died every single day at the peak. The psychological trauma of witnessing death on this scale cannot be overstated. Bodies piled up in streets, funeral pyres burned continuously, families were wiped out, economic activity ground to a halt as people avoided public spaces and markets. The military was devastated. Legions which normally maintained fighting strength through regular recruitment found themselves unable to replace losses. Young men avoided enlisting, either because they were dead, sick, or terrified of entering crowded military camps where plague spread rapidly. Garrison towns along the frontiers, places where thousands of soldiers lived in close quarters, became death traps. Entire units were decimated, not by enemy action, but by disease. Agriculture collapsed in many regions. The Roman economy was fundamentally agricultural, with the vast majority of the population working in farming. When farmers died in massive numbers, fields went unplanted and unharvested. Food shortages followed. Prices spiked. The government's grain supply system, which provided free or subsidized grain to Rome's urban poor, struggled to maintain supplies. Inflation surged as the money supply remained constant while population and production crashed. Marcus Aurelius responded with every tool available to an emperor. He organized relief efforts, distributing food and medical care to affected cities. He used imperial funds to support doctors, or what passed for doctors in ancient Rome, and funded public health measures. According to sources, he even sold imperial treasures to raise money for plague relief. In 169 AD, he held a famous public auction of palace contents, jewelry, golden plates, silk robes, even Faustina's personal clothing. The message was clear. The emperor was willing to sacrifice personal wealth for the empire's survival. But all the gold in Rome's treasury couldn't stop the dying. Medicine in 165 AD was primitive by modern standards. The germ theory of disease wouldn't be understood for another 17 centuries. Roman physicians had no concept of contagion, infection, or immune response. Their treatments, bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayers to healing gods, were useless against smallpox or measles. The plague simply had to burn itself out, and that would take years. In early 169 AD, as the plague continued its devastation, Lucius Verus fell ill. The two emperors had been preparing for a military campaign on the northern frontier. Trouble was brewing there as well, and were traveling together. Lucius was stricken suddenly and died within days. He was 38 years old. Marcus Aurelius had been co-emperor for 8 years. Now he was alone. The burden of empire, which he had tried to share, rested entirely on his shoulders, and the worst was yet to come. While Rome struggled with plague, the northern frontier was collapsing. Germanic and Sarmatian tribes along the Danube River had been watching Roman weakness with growing interest. They saw legions depleted by disease. They saw garrison towns struggling with death and desertion. They saw opportunity. In 166 and 167 AD, raiding parties began crossing the Danube, testing Roman defenses. The raids were repulsed, but each year they grew bolder, more organized, more dangerous. By 169 AD, it became clear this was not ordinary raiding. Multiple tribes had formed a coalition. The Marcomanni, who lived in what is now the Czech Republic, were the dominant power. The Quadi, their neighbors and allies, joined them. The Vandals, who would later sack Rome itself, were part of the coalition. The Lombards, who would establish kingdoms in Italy, fought alongside them. Sarmatian cavalry from the Steppes provided mobile striking power. Historians estimate the coalition numbered over 100,000 warriors, an enormous force by ancient standards. In 170 AD, the coalition achieved what had not happened since Hannibal 500 years earlier. They broke through the Alpine passes and invaded Italy itself. Roman forces were caught completely unprepared. The city of Aquileia, at the northern end of the Adriatic Sea, came under siege. This was Italian soil, the heartland of the empire, ground that had not seen enemy soldiers in 2.5 centuries. The psychological shock was immense. Rome had always been invulnerable in Italy. Now barbarians were attacking Italian cities. Panic spread through Rome. Citizens remembered ancient stories of Gallic invasions, of Hannibal's army ravaging the countryside, of Rome itself being sacked. The Senate was terrified. The people demanded action. And Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who had devoted his life to studying wisdom and virtue, had no choice but to become a warrior. In late 169 or early 170 AD, Marcus left Rome and traveled north to take personal command of the legions. He would spend most of the next decade fighting on the Danube frontier. He would live in military camps, endure brutal winters in Central Europe, order thousands to their deaths, and watch thousands more die from disease and battle. The philosopher king was now a war leader, and the irony was absolute. The Marcomannic Wars had begun. They would consume the rest of Marcus's life and define his reign as much as his philosophical writings. Part 3. The Marcomannic Wars, Rome's Forgotten Crisis. By late 170 AD, Marcus Aurelius had established his command headquarters at Carnuntum, a legionary fortress on the Danube River in what is now eastern Austria. Carnuntum was not Rome. There were no marble temples, no luxurious palaces, no philosophical academies. It was a military base. Wooden barracks, stone fortifications, supply depots, and thousands of professional soldiers preparing for war. This harsh frontier would be Marcus's home for most of the next decade. The strategic situation was desperate. The Germanic Sarmatian coalition that had invaded Italy in 170 AD had been pushed back across the Alps, but barely. Roman forces were stretched thin, undermanned due to plague losses, and facing enemies who had tasted victory and wanted more. The Danube frontier stretched for hundreds of miles from modern Switzerland to the Black Sea, and every mile needed defending. Marcus had perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 soldiers available across the entire frontier, an enormous force by ancient standards, but insufficient for the task at hand. The Germanic tribes Rome faced were not the primitive barbarians of Roman propaganda. The Marcomanni, Quadi, and their allies had been living next to Rome's frontier for generations. They had learned Roman tactics, traded with Roman merchants, and understood Roman military organization. Their warriors were fierce, brave, and increasingly sophisticated in their warfare. They fought in dense infantry formations, used cavalry effectively, and had developed siege tactics that allowed them to attack fortified towns. These were dangerous enemies. Marcus's first priority was stabilizing the frontier and preventing another invasion of Italy. Throughout 171 and 172 AD, Roman forces conducted defensive operations, strengthening fortifications, rebuilding depleted garrisons, and pushing Germanic forces back across the Danube. It was grinding, exhausting work. Small unit actions, skirmishes, ambushes, and occasional pitched battles consumed resources and men but produced no decisive results. The tribes would raid, Romans would respond, the tribes would retreat, and the cycle would continue. Recruiting soldiers became a critical challenge. The plague had killed so many potential recruits that traditional sources were exhausted. Marcus took unprecedented measures. He recruited slaves, promising freedom after service. He recruited gladiators, men trained in combat but normally considered too dangerous for military service. He raised auxiliary units from allied tribes, Germans fighting Germans. He even created two entirely new legions, Legio Genu Italica and Legio III Italica, recruiting heavily in Italy itself. This was extraordinary. Italy had been exempt from military conscription for over a century, with legions recruited from the provinces. Marcus's decision to recruit Italians showed how desperate the manpower situation had become. In 172 AD, Marcus felt strong enough to launch offensive operations. Roman legions crossed the Danube and invaded Germanic territory in Bohemia and Moravia. This was not conquest in the traditional sense. Rome didn't have the resources to occupy territory permanently yet. Instead, the strategy was punitive: destroy villages, burn crops, kill warriors, and break the tribe's ability to threaten Rome. It was brutal warfare, designed to inflict maximum damage and create fear. One campaign, in 172 AD, became legendary and illustrates how desperate the fighting had become. A Roman force operating deep in Quadi territory became surrounded by enemy warriors. The Roman position was nearly hopeless. The legionaries were cut off from water supplies, exhausted and facing imminent destruction. The summer heat was brutal, and soldiers were dying of thirst as much as from enemy action. But what happened next was miraculous. A massive thunderstorm suddenly erupted. Rain fell in torrents, allowing the Romans to drink and recover their strength. At the same time, lightning strikes and hail hit the Quadi forces, scattering them in panic and confusion. The Romans broke through the encirclement and escaped. Cassius Dio, who wrote about these wars decades later, describes the event as divine intervention. Christian sources later claim that Christian soldiers in the unit, specifically men from Legio XII Fulminata, had prayed to their god, who sent the rain in response. Pagan sources attributed the miracle to Egyptian priests traveling with the army who invoked the god Hermes, master of storms. Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic who believed in rational divine providence, apparently credited Jupiter with the miracle. A massive victory column erected in Rome after the wars depicts a giant rain deity, personified as a bearded god, pouring water over the grateful Roman soldiers while lightning strikes scatter their enemies. The rain miracle, as it became known, was commemorated on coins and became part of imperial propaganda. Between campaigns, Marcus returned to his quarters in Carnuntum or other frontier bases and wrote. The Meditations, his private philosophical journal, was composed during these years, probably between 170 and 180 AD. He wrote in Greek the language of philosophy, filling page after page with reminders, exhortations, and reflections. The text was never meant for publication. These were private notes, a Roman emperor talking to himself, trying to maintain philosophical composure while presiding over endless war. The content is remarkable for what it reveals about Marcus's mental state. He constantly reminds himself to accept fate, to not wish for things to be different than they are, to maintain equanimity regardless of circumstances. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. He writes about mortality constantly, reminding himself that death is natural and that he has no control over when it comes. Death smiles at us all, but all a man can do is smile back. He reminds himself that duty matters more than personal happiness, that he has responsibilities he cannot abandon regardless of his desires. Reading the Meditations knowing the context in which they were written is heartbreaking. This is not a serene philosopher contemplating eternal truths from a peaceful garden. This is an exhausted man in his 50s living in a military camp thousands of miles from home, ordering thousands to their deaths, watching his empire slowly crumble despite his best efforts, trying desperately to convince himself that he's doing the right thing and that his suffering has meaning. The philosophy is not abstract, it's survival strategy. By 174 AD, the military situation was improving. The Germanic tribes were being pushed back. Roman control of the Danube frontier was being reestablished. Marcus began planning something far more ambitious than mere frontier defense. He envisioned permanent conquest of the lands beyond the Danube and the creation of two entirely new Roman provinces, Marcomannia, named after the Marcomanni tribe, and Sarmatia, named after the Sarmatian peoples. This would extend Rome's border hundreds of miles north and east, encompassing all of modern Czech Republic, much of Slovakia, and parts of Poland and Hungary. The strategic logic was sound. The Danube River, while a natural barrier, was not impassable. Tribes could cross it relatively easily, and Rome was constantly reacting to invasions. By pushing the frontier north to the Carpathian Mountains and east to the natural barriers of the Eastern European plains, Rome would gain defensible borders and eliminate the Germanic threat permanently. It would require massive resources, building roads, establishing garrison towns, settling veterans, creating administrative infrastructure. But Marcus believed it was necessary for long-term security. Roman surveyors and engineers began preliminary work. Military commanders identified strategic locations for future forts. The Senate was informed of the plan and gave tentative approval. Everything seemed to be moving toward a successful conclusion to the wars. Rome would emerge from the crisis stronger and more secure than before. And then, in early 175 AD, news arrived from the east that shattered everything. Avidius Cassius, the brilliant general who had conquered Parthia, had declared himself emperor. Cassius controlled Syria, Egypt, and most of Rome's wealthy eastern provinces. He commanded multiple legions and had the support of regional governors. This was not a minor rebellion, it was a full-scale civil war. The reasons for Cassius's revolt remain disputed and probably involved a complex mix of ambition, opportunity, and miscommunication. The Historia Augusta, an ancient source collection written decades later and notoriously unreliable, provides a dramatic story. False rumors of Marcus's death reached the east. Faustina, Marcus's wife, who was with him on campaign, supposedly believed the rumors were true. Fearing for her safety and that of her children in a succession crisis, she allegedly convinced Cassius to declare himself emperor to protect the imperial family. When it became clear Marcus was actually alive, Cassius was too committed to reverse course. Most modern historians are skeptical of this account. The Historia Augusta loved scandalous stories, especially those involving sexual impropriety and conspiracy. Faustina had been the subject of salacious rumors her entire life, and implicating her in imperial treason fit the pattern. The simpler explanation is that Cassius was ambitious. Marcus had been campaigning for years and was rumored to be in declining health, and Cassius calculated he could seize power successfully. Whatever the motivation, the rebellion was serious. Cassius was a proven military commander, probably the best general Rome had produced in a generation. He was governor of Syria, one of the empire's richest provinces. Egypt, which he also controlled, was Rome's primary grain supplier. Controlling Egypt meant controlling Rome's food supply. The Eastern legions, which had served under Cassius during the Parthian War, were loyal to him personally. If civil war broke out, it would be long and bloody. Marcus Aurelius faced an impossible choice. If he left the northern frontier to deal with Cassius, the Germanic tribes would resume invasions. If he stayed to complete the conquest, Cassius would have time to consolidate power in the east. Marcus chose to confront Cassius, abandoning years of progress on the Danube and traveling east with the legions. All his strategic planning, all the vision of new provinces, all the sacrifices of Roman soldiers, everything was put on hold because of one man's ambition. Marcus's response to the rebellion is revealing about his character. He did not order mass arrests or executions of suspected conspirators. He did not purge the eastern provinces or dismiss generals who might be loyal to Cassius. He did not even declare that Cassius would be executed if captured. Instead, Marcus wrote letters saying he wanted to confront Cassius face to face, to understand why the rebellion happened, to persuade him to stand down. He told the Senate that he wished Cassius would live so that Marcus could show clemency personally. This response astonished Romans accustomed to emperors who killed at the slightest hint of conspiracy. Marcus's Stoic philosophy emphasized mercy and understanding. His teacher Epictetus had written that humans are all part of the same rational universe, all connected, all deserving of compassion even when they err. Marcus genuinely seemed to believe he could resolve the crisis through dialogue rather than violence. Whether this was philosophical wisdom or naive idealism is debatable. The question became moot. In July 175 AD, approximately 3 months after declaring himself emperor, Avidius Cassius was assassinated. A centurion named Antonius, either out of loyalty to Marcus or opportunistic calculation, murdered Cassius and sent his severed head to the emperor. The rebellion collapsed instantly. The Eastern legions proclaimed loyalty to Marcus. Regional governors who had supported Cassius scrambled to pledge allegiance. Within weeks, the crisis was over. Marcus refused to celebrate. He declared he was saddened that Cassius had died before they could meet. He forbade the Senate from executing Cassius's family or conducting broad purges of his supporters. Only the actual conspirators, those who had actively participated in the usurpation, were punished. The rest received pardons. It was an extraordinary display of mercy by Roman standards, where failed usurpers typically saw their entire family line eradicated, but mercy couldn't undo the damage. Marcus spent the rest of 175 AD and much of 176 AD touring the eastern provinces, meeting with governors, reassuring legions, and demonstrating imperial presence. It was necessary. The provinces needed to see their emperor, to know that Marcus was alive, healthy, and in command. But every month spent in the east was a month not spent on the Danube. The Germanic tribes used the reprieve to rebuild their forces and prepare for renewed war. During this eastern tour, tragedy struck again. Faustina died suddenly in winter 175 AD. She was probably in her mid-40s. though the circumstances of her death are unclear. Marcus was devastated, despite decades of rumors about her infidelity, despite the vicious gossip that followed her constantly. He had loved Faustina genuinely and deeply. He had her deified by Senate decree, Diva Faustina, the divine Faustina, worthy of temples and worship. He established charitable foundations in her name to help orphaned girls. He named a city after her in Cappadocia, where she died, and in his meditations written in the privacy of his tent, he never mentioned her death. Perhaps the grief was too personal to commit to writing. Perhaps some pain was beyond even philosophical consolation. By late 176 or early 177 AD, Marcus was back on the Danube frontier. The Germanic tribes had resumed hostilities. The peace treaties negotiated before Marcus's departure to the east had broken down. Raiding was escalating into full-scale warfare again. All the progress of 171 to 174 AD seemed wasted. The cycle of violence was beginning anew, and Marcus Aurelius, now 55 years old, exhausted from years of campaigning, grieving for his wife, was forced to start over. He made one more critical decision that would doom everything he had fought for. He brought his son Commodus to the frontier and elevated him to co-emperor. Part 4. The Endless War and Commodus. Commodus was born on August 31st, 161 AD, the same year his father Marcus Aurelius became emperor. He entered the world alongside a twin brother, Titus Aurelius Fulvus Antoninus, but the twin died in infancy. One of many children Marcus and Faustina lost. Of 13 children born to the imperial couple, Commodus was the only son who survived past early childhood. In a family plagued by devastating infant mortality, his survival seemed like fate. Perhaps it was divine will. Perhaps he was destined to inherit the empire. But destiny does not guarantee virtue. As a boy and teenager, Commodus showed little interest in the education typical of Roman aristocrats. He didn't care for philosophy, rhetoric, or literature. He wasn't particularly interested in military strategy or imperial administration. What captivated him was spectacle, gladiatorial combat, wild beast hunts, chariot racing, and physical prowess. He trained obsessively with weapons, not as a soldier preparing for war, but as a performer preparing for the arena. This obsession disturbed Marcus Aurelius. Roman aristocrats enjoyed gladiatorial games as entertainment, but they didn't train as gladiators themselves. Gladiators were slaves, condemned criminals, or desperately poor free men who sold themselves into what was essentially armed slavery. They were infames, people without honor or legal standing. For an emperor's son to aspire to fight as a gladiator was profoundly inappropriate, almost incomprehensible. Yet Commodus was fascinated by it, and as he grew older, the fascination deepened into obsession. Commodus was cruel, vain, and vindictive. Stories circulated about his behavior towards servants and slaves, his quick temper, his enjoyment of others' suffering. Marcus Aurelius was not blind to his son's flaws. The emperor had spent his entire life studying Stoic philosophy, which emphasized honest self-assessment and clear-eyed evaluation of reality. He knew Commodus was unsuited for rule. But Commodus was also his only surviving son, his biological heir, the last male descendant of his bloodline. The question Marcus faced was fundamental and deeply personal. Should he honor the principle of merit and adopt a worthy successor, or should he follow the natural law of blood succession and pass power to his son? For over a century, Rome's greatest emperors had chosen adoption over biology. Nerva adopted Trajan, Trajan adopted Hadrian, Hadrian forced Antoninus Pius to adopt Marcus Aurelius. Each time, merit triumphed over bloodline, and Rome prospered under emperors chosen for capability rather than birth. But each of those emperors lacked surviving sons. They adopted out of necessity. Marcus had a living heir. The political, social, and cultural pressure to pass power to his own child was immense. Marcus may also have hoped that maturity and responsibility would improve his son. Many parents believe their troubled children will grow into better adults when faced with real challenges. Perhaps Marcus thought that exposure to military life, to the harsh realities of command and warfare, to the weight of duty, would transform Commodus into something greater. On November 27, 176 AD, Marcus Aurelius made Commodus co-emperor. The boy was 15 years old, young but not unprecedentedly so. In 177 AD, Marcus and Commodus traveled together to the Danube frontier to resume the war against the Germanic tribes. Father and son would spend the next 3 years campaigning together, and Marcus would have ample opportunity to see whether his hopes for Commodus's transformation were justified. They were not. The second phase of the Marcomannic Wars was even more grueling than the first. The Germanic coalition had used the 3-year reprieve while Marcus dealt with Cassius's rebellion to rebuild their military capacity. They had learned from their defeats. Instead of attempting another invasion of Roman territory, they focused on defensive warfare in their own lands. When Roman legions crossed the Danube and advanced into Germanic territory, they encountered scorched earth. Villages burned, crops destroyed, populations evacuated deep into forests and mountains. The tribes avoided large-scale battles where Roman discipline gave overwhelming advantage. Instead, they employed guerrilla tactics, ambushes, night raids, attacks on supply columns, then melting away before Roman forces could respond effectively. This type of warfare was exhausting and frustrating. There were no grand victories, no decisive battles, no dramatic moments that could be commemorated in triumphal arches. Just slow, grinding progress measured in burned villages and negotiated treaties with individual tribes. Roman soldiers died from ambushes, from disease, from exposure during brutal Central European winters. Progress was incremental and constantly threatened by setbacks. Marcus established command headquarters at various locations along the frontier, depending on where fighting was heaviest. Vindobona, modern Vienna, served as one major base. Sirmium, in what is now Serbia, was another command center. Carnuntum remained important. These were not comfortable imperial residences, but functional military fortresses designed for war, not luxury. Marcus lived simply, sharing conditions with his soldiers, eating military rations, enduring the same hardships. He was now in his mid-50s, and the years of campaigning were taking a physical toll. Commodus, meanwhile, learned nothing. He showed no interest in military strategy, didn't participate meaningfully in planning sessions, and seemed to view the entire war as an inconvenience, keeping him from Rome's pleasures. He complained about conditions, demanded luxuries inappropriate for a military camp, and made clear his desire to return to the capital as soon as possible. Officers and soldiers noticed. Word spread through the army that the emperor's son and heir was unfit for command, uninterested in duty, and concerned only with his own comfort. Marcus had to see it. The philosophical detachment he had cultivated his entire life, the Stoic acceptance of reality as it is rather than as he wished it to be, all of that meant he could not delude himself about Commodus's character. His son was not maturing. Responsibility was not transforming him. The harsh realities of war were not teaching him wisdom or duty. Commodus was exactly what he had always been, and the burden of the empire would soon rest on his shoulders. But what could Marcus do? Commodus had been proclaimed Augustus, full co-emperor with equal authority. Removing him would require Senate approval and would certainly provoke political crisis, possibly civil war. Commodus had supporters in the court, among the Praetorian Guard, and in the army, men who benefited from their relationship with the heir or who believed in the principle of dynastic succession. Attempting to disinherit Commodus might tear the empire apart, just as Marcus was trying to secure it. Marcus loved his son. Commodus was the last surviving male child from 13 births. Every other son had died, in infancy, in childhood, from plague or disease, or the thousand dangers that killed children in ancient Rome. A father who had buried that many children might cling to the one who survived, despite his flaws. Love can blind even philosophers to reality they would clearly see in others. The campaigns continued year after year. 178 AD brought small victories against the Quadi. 179 AD saw successful operations against the Marcomanni. Each year produced negotiated treaties with individual tribes, submissions of tribal leaders, promises of peace, and delivery of hostages to ensure compliance. The Germanic coalition was being slowly ground down by Roman persistence and superior resources, but it was taking everything Rome had. The treasury was strained, legions were operating below full strength. Plague still flared occasionally, killing soldiers and civilians. The empire was exhausted. Marcus continued planning for total victory and permanent annexation. The vision of creating Marcomannia and Sarmatia provinces remained his strategic goal. Roman engineers prepared surveys for road construction. Military commanders identified locations for permanent garrisons. Administrative officials planned provincial governance structures. But time was running out faster than Marcus knew. Between battles and administrative duties, Marcus still wrote in his journal. The later books of the Meditations, probably written in the final years of his life, are darker in tone than earlier sections. He writes more frequently about death and acceptance of mortality. Do not act as if you had 10,000 years to live. Death hangs over you while you live, while it is in your power. Be good. He reminds himself that everything is transient, that loss is inevitable, that attachment to outcomes causes suffering. Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight. These are not the writings of a man at peace. They are the writings of an exhausted man trying to convince himself that his suffering has meaning, that his sacrifices matter, that he's doing the right thing despite the crushing burden. The Meditations reveal someone struggling to maintain philosophical composure while reality overwhelms him. He had spent his life studying how to live well. Now, in his late 50s, dying slowly in a frozen military camp, he was studying how to die well. In early 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius fell seriously ill. He was 58 years old. He had been emperor for 19 years and spent more than a decade of that time on campaign. His body had endured more than most men could survive. The illness progressed rapidly. Within days or weeks, it became clear Marcus would not recover. He prepared for death with the same philosophical discipline he had tried to apply to life. Marcus summoned his closest advisors and told them not to weep for him, but to weep for the coming troubles. A clear-eyed assessment of what Commodus's reign would bring. He allegedly told Commodus himself to focus on the safety of the state, not personal pleasure, though whether Commodus listened is doubtful. On March 17, 180 AD, at either Vindobona or nearby Sirmium, Marcus Aurelius died. His final words, according to legend, were about duty and the state rather than personal concerns. It was a Stoic death, accepting, dignified, focused on something larger than individual survival. The Senate immediately voted to deify him, placing Marcus Aurelius among the gods as Divus Marcus Aurelius. Statues would be erected, temples dedicated, his memory honored. But his empire died with him. Part 5. Death, Legacy, and the Fall. Commodus was 19 years old when his father died, and his first act as sole emperor revealed everything about his priorities and character. Within weeks of Marcus's death, Commodus initiated peace negotiations with the Germanic tribes. The talks concluded quickly with terms that shocked many in Rome's military and senate. The tribes agreed to return Roman prisoners, provide military recruits for auxiliary units, and respect the Danube frontier. In exchange, Rome abandoned all plans for annexing Germanic territory, and creating the new provinces of Marcomannia and Sarmatia. 10 years of war, thousands of Roman soldiers dead, the imperial treasury drained, Marcus Aurelius's entire strategic vision, all of it abandoned for a return to the pre-war status quo. The Germanic threat that had motivated the entire conflict remained exactly what it had been in 166 AD. Nothing had fundamentally changed, except that Rome was weaker, poorer, and its enemies knew Roman power was not limitless. Commodus left the frontier in summer 180 AD and returned to Rome. In October, he celebrated a magnificent triumph, parading through the city with Germanic prisoners, captured weapons, and wagons of spoils. The Roman people lined the streets and cheered. The Senate assembled to witness the spectacle and offer formal congratulations. Nobody seemed to notice, or perhaps nobody dared mention, that the triumph celebrated a war that ended in negotiated settlement rather than conquest. The triumph was for Marcus Aurelius's campaigns, but Marcus was dead. Commodus claimed the glory. What followed over the next 12 years was one of the most catastrophic reigns in Roman imperial history. Commodus had no interest in governance. He appointed a succession of advisors and favorites to handle imperial administration, men like Tigidius Perennis, the Praetorian prefect, and later Cleander, a former slave who rose to extraordinary power. These men made policy, managed the provinces, and controlled access to the emperor, while Commodus focused on his true passion, gladiatorial combat. This was not a symbolic or ceremonial appearance in the arena. Commodus trained intensively as a gladiator and fought publicly in the Colosseum multiple times. He killed wild animals, lions, elephants, ostriches, by the hundreds, shooting them with arrows from elevated platforms. He fought human opponents, though these fights were carefully staged to ensure the emperor's victory. Opponents used blunted weapons while Commodus used sharpened steel. Wounded gladiators were forced to grovel before him as he delivered theatrical killing blows. The Roman people were horrified and fascinated in equal measure. Watching the emperor of Rome fight as a gladiator was transgressive in ways difficult to fully appreciate from modern perspective. Gladiators were infames, people without honor, social standing, or legal protection. They were slaves or criminals or desperate men who had sold themselves into bondage. The emperor was supposed to be the embodiment of Roman dignity, gravitas, and authority. Commodus performing as a gladiator was like a modern head of state appearing in pornography, technically legal perhaps, but so inappropriate that it shattered fundamental social categories. But Commodus didn't care about propriety. He proclaimed himself the reincarnation of Hercules, the divine hero of Greek mythology. He appeared in public wearing lion skins and carrying a club. He renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed all 12 months of the year after himself and his titles: Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Herculius, Romanus, Exuperatorius, Amazonius, Invictus, Felix, Pius. The Senate, cowed by fear of execution, formally approved these absurdities. The megalomania was matched by paranoia. Commodus saw conspiracies everywhere. He executed senators, aristocrats, and military commanders on the flimsiest pretexts or on no pretext at all, beyond suspicion. His own sister, Lucilla, conspired against him in 182 AD, only 2 years into his reign, and was executed along with numerous alleged co-conspirators. The conspiracy was probably real. Lucilla had been empress during Lucius Verus's lifetime and deeply resented her younger brother. But Commodus's response went far beyond the actual plotters. Anyone associated with Lucilla, anyone who might have known about the plot, anyone who had criticized the emperor, all faced death. The purges continued throughout his reign. Prefects, generals, and advisors who had served Marcus Aurelius loyally were removed and often killed. The imperial court became a snake pit where survival required constant flattery, where criticism meant death, where informants thrived and integrity was fatal. Men who had helped govern the empire for decades disappeared overnight. Experience and competence were replaced by sycophancy and fear. The economic impact was devastating. Commodus spent enormous sums on gladiatorial games and spectacles. He held events lasting days, featuring thousands of animals and hundreds of gladiators. The treasury couldn't sustain this spending while also maintaining the military, infrastructure, and administrative services. Taxes increased. Provincial governors were given quotas to extract from their territories. Corruption exploded as officials squeezed populations to meet imperial demands while skimming profits for themselves. The orderly, competent government Marcus had maintained collapsed into predatory extraction. Inflation surged. The silver content of Roman coinage had been declining gradually for decades, but under Commodus, the debasement accelerated. Merchants raised prices to compensate for worthless money. Soldiers demanded higher pay. The government printed more debased coins, creating a vicious cycle. Economic confidence evaporated. Trade contracted. The prosperity that had characterized the Antonine era vanished. Military discipline deteriorated. Commodus had no interest in military affairs and left army management to corrupt officials who sold promotions, embezzled pay, and allowed standards to collapse. The legions that had held the frontier under Marcus's command became less effective, less disciplined, less feared by Rome's enemies. Germanic tribes noticed, Parthia noticed. Everywhere Rome's enemies grew bolder, testing defenses, probing for weakness. By 192 AD, after 12 years of Commodus's rule, Rome was unrecognizable from the empire Marcus had left. Multiple conspiracies were forming, involving senators, praetorian guards, imperial household staff, and even Commodus's own mistress, Marcia. The emperor had alienated virtually everyone. His behavior had become increasingly erratic and violent. He planned to inaugurate the new year, 193 AD, by appearing as a gladiator in the Colosseum while serving as consul, a bizarre plan that would humiliate Rome's highest office. On December 31st, 1920 AD, the conspirators struck. They tried poison first, administered in wine by Marcia, but Commodus vomited it up. The conspirators panicked. If Commodus recovered, they would all die. They sent Narcissus, a wrestler and athlete who served in the imperial household, to finish the job. Narcissus strangled Commodus in his bath. The emperor, who styled himself as Hercules, the divine hero, died at age 31 at the hands of a hired killer, unmourned by virtually anyone in the empire. The Senate met immediately and declared damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Commodus's name was erased from public monuments and inscriptions. His statues were torn down. His reforms were reversed. Rome became Rome again, not Colonia Commodiana. The months returned to their traditional names. Every trace of his reign was to be obliterated from public memory. In Roman political culture, damnatio memoriae was the ultimate punishment, not just death but erasure, as if the person had never existed. But the damage was irreversible. The principle that had made Rome great for over a century, choosing the best man to rule through adoption rather than birth, had been abandoned. Marcus Aurelius's decision to pass power to his biological son despite Commodus's unfitness had restored dynastic succession. The precedent was set, and Rome would suffer the consequences for the next century. What followed was chaos. Pertinax, a respected senator and military commander in his 60s, was proclaimed emperor. He was everything Commodus was not: disciplined, competent, serious about governance. He immediately began reforms, restoring the treasury, reducing imperial expenses, punishing corruption, and attempting to restore military discipline. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite imperial bodyguard, was furious. Pertinax tried to reduce their privileges and hold them accountable. On March the 28th, 193 AD, only 93 days after becoming emperor, a group of Praetorian guards broke into the palace and murdered Pertinax. And then the Praetorian Guard did something that shocked the Roman world. They announced they would auction the empire. Literally, senators and wealthy men could bid for the throne, and whoever offered the most money to the Praetorians would become emperor. It was the ultimate degradation of imperial dignity, the ruler of 70 million people, commander of the greatest military on earth, master of an empire spanning 3 continents, for sale like a slave at auction. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, won the auction by promising 25,000 sesterces to each Praetorian guardsman, an enormous sum, perhaps equivalent to 5 years' pay for a soldier. He was proclaimed emperor and took power. The Senate, thoroughly cowed, formally ratified his accession. For a brief moment, it seemed the crisis might pass. It did not. Legions across the empire refused to accept an emperor who bought the throne through bribery. 3 powerful generals declared themselves rival emperors: Septimius Severus, commander of the Pannonian legions along the Danube; Pescennius Niger, governor of Syria controlling the wealthy eastern provinces; and Clodius Albinus, governor of Britain commanding the legions in the west. Each had the loyalty of their troops and the resources of their regions. Rome faced civil war on a scale not seen since 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors over a century earlier. Septimius Severus moved first and fastest. He marched his Danubian legions on Rome, covering the distance at extraordinary speed. The Praetorian Guard, which had murdered 1 emperor and auctioned the empire, refused to defend Didius Julianus. The Senate, sensing which way power was shifting, condemned Julianus to death. He was executed on June 1st, 193 AD, having reigned only 66 days. Severus entered Rome without resistance and immediately began consolidating power. But the civil war was just beginning. Pescennius Niger in the east had to be defeated. Severus marched east with his legions and fought a series of brutal battles in Asia Minor. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Issus in 194 AD, coincidentally the same location where Alexander the Great had defeated the Persians 700 years earlier. Severus won decisively. Niger fled and was hunted down and killed. Severus then brutally punished every city and province that had supported Niger. Thousands were executed. Property was confiscated. Entire cities lost their privileges and rights. Next came Clodius Albinus in Britain. Severus had initially offered to make Albinus his heir, buying time while he dealt with Niger. Now, with the east secured, Severus turned west. Albinus crossed from Britain to Gaul with his legions. The 2 armies met at the Battle of Lugdunum, modern lie in France, in February 197 AD. It was one of the bloodiest battles between Roman armies in history. Ancient sources claim over 150,000 soldiers fought and tens of thousands died. Severus won, but barely. Albinus committed suicide. Severus ordered his head cut off and sent to Rome as a warning. After 5 years of civil war, Septimius Severus emerged as sole emperor. But Rome had fundamentally changed. Severus was a military dictator who ruled through the army. He openly declared that keeping the soldiers happy was the key to power. He increased military pay significantly, expanded the army's size, and gave soldiers privileges and legal protections far beyond what they had held previously. The Senate became essentially irrelevant, a formal body that rubber-stamped imperial decisions but held no real power. The provinces existed primarily to supply the military with money, resources, and recruits. This was the Severan dynasty, and it would rule Rome for decades. But the character of the empire had changed irrevocably. Rome was no longer governed by the principles of the Antonine era. It was a military autocracy where power came from controlling legions, where imperial succession was determined by army loyalty rather than Senate approval, where provincial governors were essentially warlords with official titles. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace that had endured for 200 years, was over. Marcus Aurelius's death in 180 AD marked its end. What followed was the crisis of the 3rd century, 50 years of nearly continuous civil war, barbarian invasions, economic collapse, plague, and imperial fragmentation. Between 235 and 284 AD, over 50 men claimed the title of emperor. Almost all died violently. At one point, the empire split into 3 separate states: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the Rump Roman Empire in Italy and Africa. Modern historians continue debating Marcus's legacy. Some argue he was too philosophical, too idealistic, too reluctant to use ruthless methods that might have prevented disaster. Others defend Marcus as a fundamentally good man trying to do right in impossible circumstances. The plague, the Germanic invasions, the Parthian War, the rebellion of Cassius. Any one of these would have challenged the greatest emperor. Marcus faced all of them simultaneously while trying to maintain philosophical principles and human decency. That he succeeded as well as he did is remarkable. That he ultimately failed to prevent Rome's decline doesn't erase his achievements. His true legacy is not political, but philosophical. The meditation survived because someone preserved the text after Marcus's death. It circulated slowly at first, copied by hand, read by philosophers and educated Romans. Over centuries, it spread across the Mediterranean world, translated into Latin, Arabic, and eventually every major language on earth. Today, it remains one of the most widely read philosophical texts, studied by everyone from corporate executives to military officers to ordinary people seeking guidance. The Meditations speak to people across 2,000 years because they address universal human struggles that transcend specific historical context. How to find meaning when life seems futile, how to maintain integrity when surrounded by corruption, how to accept loss without despair. Generations later, people read his words, seeking the same survival strategies. All good things must come to an end. Marcus Aurelius knew this truth better than anyone. He lived it, wrote about it, embodied it. He watched paradise crumble despite his best efforts. He was Rome's last good emperor, and his death marked the end of the Golden Age. The philosopher king is dead. Rome survived another 3 centuries, but the age of greatness died with Marcus Aurelius on that cold March day in 180 AD. All good things must come to an end.